What's up guys, this is Desm101. Welcome back to my channel. Today, let's take a look at a Sega Saturn game from one of my favorite series. Shinobi, arguably one of gaming's most iconic and well-known ninjas, is familiar to most retro gamers. I remember playing Shinobi in the arcade in the late 80s and being mesmerized by the colorful graphics and tight, simple gameplay that quickly became incredibly challenging and complex to master. The original Shinobi Arcade game was released in 1987 on the Sega System 16 hardware and was similar in presentation and gameplay to Namco's Rolling Thunder. You take control of Joe Musashi as he seeks to free students of the Iga clan from the clutches of Zeed. You need to rescue all the hostages before you can move on to the next stage, and you have to defeat a boss at the end of each level after 3 stages. The game saw ports on many platforms, including the PC Engine, Commodore 64, MSX, and Sega's own Master System, to name a few. The sequel, The Revenge of Shinobi, was only released on the Sega Genesis in 1989, although its spiritual sequel, Shadow Dancer, did see an arcade release, as well as a Sega Genesis port. It did a great job of showing off what the Sega Genesis could do. With amazing art design and gameplay, it was largely an improvement in most areas over the first game, from a more traditional looking ninja with a face mask this time, to increased number of attacks and selectable ninja magic, as well as a touchy double jump maneuver that you'll need to master. Add the excellent soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro, and you have a definite undisputed classic. Shinobi 3 was released in 1993, once again on the Sega Genesis, and with more impressive graphics, faster gameplay, and perhaps a more inviting difficulty for newcomers. The game really pushes the Genesis to its limit with tons of layers of parallax and graphical effects, plus beautiful art and design, and of course those rocking jams that really does the Sega Genesis sound justice. The game, however, wasn't reviewed quite as well as the previous entry in the series, perhaps due to the majority of gameplay remaining on the same par as before, but it did a pretty good job as a continuation of the series. So what about the successor on the Sega Saturn? Surely, since Sonic was not going to have a regular entry on the system, Shinobi must have been a top priority to flex the 2D muscle on the system. At least that's what you'd think. Shin Shinobi, aka Shinobi Legions, aka Shinobi X, was released on the Sega Saturn in 1995. The plot involves Sho being one of 3 students being taught the ninja arts. One of the other students, Kazuma, has the cliché lust for power and ends up leaving the teachings and returns later to kidnap Aya, the 3rd student. And so, Sho must go after Kazuma to free Aya. It takes the art style in a new direction and uses digitized sprites similar to Mortal Kombat, with the pre-rendered models tossed in for good measure. While the game doesn't look terrible, it's definitely quite dated and hasn't aged well compared to the more traditional art of the previous entries. The gameplay focuses more on melee attacks instead of projectiles, and our ninja Sho can block using his sword by holding the attack button. His attacks are further increased as well, from a forward thrust to a downward pogo jump slash, running slash, and sword spin, but we do lose the jump kick from the previous game. He can also hit enemy projectiles back at them, which is a pretty nice touch, but tough to utilize in a hairy situation. The pickups are changed a bit as well. Now you can collect blue stones that will give you an extra life after 10 are acquired, health bar max increases, as well as the standard throwing knives and health power-ups. There are a few types of ninja magic that are all pickups. Now it plays a bit slower than the previous game, feels somewhat sluggish and clunky at times when you are fighting certain enemies. Thankfully, the ability to block can help this often. The enemies are pretty standard fare and not really very interesting in terms of design. Ninjas, soldiers, generic goblin things, yakuza. And that is one of the biggest knocks to the game. The overall art design just wasn't very well executed. The cutscenes that play out between each level give an example of this poor execution. They feature low quality acting, shoddy costumes, and silly looking action. The levels are pretty straightforward and don't do much to add to the change of pace like we saw in Shinobi 3 with the auto-scrolling stages. While there is a minecart stage, but it does turn into a slog of strict memorization trial and error routine. If they could have taken the time to develop or refine the main character sprite a bit more, and add more variety of enemies and some unique levels, it could have really improved the impression of the game. It could have also used more fine-tuning on the action, made it faster and more responsive. The game plays out like a rehash of some of the previous stages and enemies from earlier games in the series. Finally, the bosses are similar in this regard, definitely not as interesting as bosses from the previous. The music is not bad, but not very memorable and a tad bland. They replaced the music with a different soundtrack in the European release, Shinobi X, that improved it. The US version wasn't even published by Sega and instead released by Vic Tokai. It's still a pretty fun game in the long run for the Saturn, but as a Shinobi game it has a hard time living up to the standards set by the previous generation. It just doesn't quite feel as polished as a Shinobi game should be. I remember playing this when it first came out, and I really did enjoy it. Even though the graphics weren't very good, I was feeling that MK vibe. But it still felt like a bit of an oddball compared to the Sega Genesis games. There were a few more Shinobi games released. A GBA game that was entirely pre-rendered graphics, and the highly regarded PS2 games that brought the series into 3D, as well as a 3DS game that returns to the classic 2D gameplay. If you're looking for a good 2D side-scroller action game on the Saturn, this one's a good one to pick up, and I would recommend the Japanese version since it's more affordable. If you're looking for more of that classic retro ninja gameplay, I recommend checking out Ninja 5.0 on GBA or Strider 2 on PS1. And that's going to wrap it up for today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a good one.